All right, I do want to talk more about this. And certainly we've seen just in the last year, incident after incident of police using violent force on nonviolent offenders. We've also seen them use extreme force, pepper spray, for example, directly in people's eyes, on protesters in California who were sitting down in a line. We've seen more deaths come about from people who were tased. And it begs the question, why? What's going on here? Sahar Aziz is an associate professor at Texas Wesleyan University School of Law and a legal fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Now, she wrote an article recently called From the Oppressed to the Terrorists that can be found on saharazizlaw.com. She joins me now from Chicago. Hey there. Let's talk first about some of the underlying issues here. It's often race, often African Americans, but people are targeted. How far has this country come, though, in the last 20 years?
Well, I think there's certainly been progress with regard to police brutality. I think it was much more prevalent maybe 3, 4, 6, or 5 decades ago. However, unfortunately, as your statistics show, it has not decreased sufficiently. And what's happened is it's shifted from murder or shots being fired by a gun to tasers that can kill people or put them in a coma or temporarily make them unconscious. And oftentimes it's still excessive use of force. And I think many police officers think, well, I'm not using a gun, so therefore I can more freely use a taser or other forms such as pepper spray, but they use it excessively, and that can cause, while it may not cause death, it certainly can cause injury.
Well, it doesn't usually cause death, but I know that Amnesty International came out with a report just earlier this year that showed that more than 500 people in the U.S. have actually died after police officers used tasers on them. And 90% of those people were unarmed suspects. I think most people would argue that stun guns are better than real guns. But at what point did tasers and stun guns start being used as the first line of offense?
Well, I think it was a response to the litigation, and so I think this was a way for the police departments to try to decrease the violence and certainly decrease the statistics of those who die in arrest-related activities. However, as I stated, it may have solved one problem but created another one that could potentially be worse because the volume may be higher. So even though the injury may not be as severe, and again, people have died from tasers, but the volume may be higher. So I think that part of it is cultural, is that they feel more free to be able to do that with the excuse of, well, at least we weren't shooting, which I think is an unacceptable response. I think also part of it is this aversion and this aggression towards protest. And this is part of a post 9/11 trend where, in the name of national security, in the name of keeping society safer, the police are given free rein to do things that I think are going overboard, such as this excessive tasering and excessive pepper spraying to protesters. These are people that are supposed to be protected by the First Amendment. These are not people that should be subjected to excessive force.
I think it's a really important point. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were showing police taking extreme measures to deal with the Occupy Wall Street protesters right here in the U.S. We're talking about police using issued weapons, in many cases on unarmed people. We're talking about them using pepper spray, less than 12 inches from their faces. Why has this, I think you're onto something here. It's the post 9/11 mentality, new laws being formulated to basically stop people from protesting except in designated, free speech zones in a lot of cases. But do you think, especially after the Occupy Wall Street stuff, do you think this is something that we'll continue to see?
Well, I think it's really up to the citizenry. I think that those who are injured should file suit, and I think they should hold the police departments accountable, and they should hold their public officials accountable and make sure that they are not excessively using that authority. I think they also need to hold those government officials accountable for this chilling effect that's being caused. Is if you feel that you're going to go protest in the street and get tasered and get pepper sprayed and possibly die from it, you may think twice about going out and protesting. So there is certainly a political dimension to it. And I think we have to talk about the racial dimension. For example, in the New York Police Department, they have this stop and frisk program. 684,000 people just in 2011 were stopped, questioned, and frisked. 80% of them were African American. And then 58% of those that are tasered in New York are blacks and Latinos. So part of it is this has actually been going on for a while, and also a lot of Latinos are getting tasered as part of deportation processes. But the Occupy movement, many of those who were tasered were Anglo, and so that brought it to the forefront in the media. And so I think now it's time for all of these different communities to come together and hold the police departments and their public officials accountable and say, excessive violence is unacceptable. It should be an exception, not the norm.
It's really interesting, too, when you look at so many of these cases, officers are either cleared or put on paid administrative leave. And, I think it's fair to say that incidents like this, at least in the long run, will make police officers' jobs more difficult, not less. I know, when I worked in local news, so often police would be investigating a crime, but no one in these neighborhoods where a lot of these crimes are committed would talk to them because, sometimes they had loyalties to people involved, but other times they just simply didn't trust the police. Why don't they trust the police? Well, so often police, commit these kind of crimes and perform this kind of brutality and never are held accountable. I guess I'm wondering, do you think that there's a larger discussion that needs to be had here about the message that these departments are sending?
Well, I absolutely do. I think, again, part of it is part of the post 9/11 mentality of undying loyalty to the police, undying loyalty to law enforcement, and trying. What's been happening is many agencies, local, state, and federal, are trying to use the national security paradigm in order to expand their discretion and expand their authorities and tell the public, just trust us, trust us. And then when someone does get hurt, if it's a minority, oftentimes a racial minority, then that falls under the stereotype, well, he was African American, so he's probably a gangster. Well, he was Latino, he was probably undocumented. Well, he was Arab or Muslim, he was probably a terrorist. And so all of these stereotypes are used to essentially excuse the government and excuse the police from being held accountable. So I think we have to make a connection between them. But I think all Americans have to realize that when you have excessive force, particularly in political context and political protest, the First Amendment is under attack. And we have to hold them accountable. It doesn't matter what the race of the person is, and it doesn't matter what the gender is. No one deserves to be violated in that way.
Sahar, what's your response to some of these police officers, some of these police chiefs who say, you know what, we've got to watch out for the safety of our communities. We have to know that our officers feel safe doing their jobs. You hear this same excuse being used in war zones that, soldiers and Marines, they need to know that they're not going to get in trouble for shooting somebody if they feel like their lives or their safety is in jeopardy. And so often that's the excuse that's given, even though, studies with police forces here show otherwise. What's the answer to dealing with that, to police officers saying we need to know that we can do our job well without being punished?
Well, I think I agree that we all benefit from public safety. We all benefit from the police doing their job right, and the operative term is doing it right and doing it in conformance with the Constitution. But one thing that has come up, or one technology is interesting, which is the recording of arrests. So whenever a police officer uses his sirens or her sirens, the recording starts. And oftentimes with many of these cases of excessive violence or death as a result, as part of the arrest, they claim that the person was armed or that the person was fighting back in a combative way, and so they had no other choice but to shoot or taser or pepper spray. And then it turns out when they go look at the surveillance and the recording that in fact none of that was true. So in some ways the technology is, I think, a positive development. And so then if the police feel that they need to use force, the recording will defend them. But at the same time, if they abuse their authority and they lie in order to save their own skin, then they'll get caught in it. So part of it is that.
It's a really good point. With everyone having cameras and even video cameras on their phones now, it's much more difficult for police to be able to give those arguments without the evidence being put forth there. Sahar Aziz, an associate professor at Texas Wesleyan University School of Law, also a legal fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding.